The Case for an Intellectual Revolution in Rwanda. I am thinking out loud, and it hurts them. Written by Gabriel Ndayishimiye. Published by LivenBooks. Section 3. Rwanda's Anti-Intellectual Culture, Silencing Thought, Punishing Inquiry. Rwanda's political order does not just discourage dissent, it fosters a culture that is actively hostile to critical thinking, reflecting what Paulo Freire described as the banking model of education, where knowledge is deposited into passive minds without encouraging reflection or critical consciousness. In such a system, learners are conditioned to accept the status quo rather than question it, and education becomes a tool of domination rather than liberation. This is not a byproduct of governance, but a deliberate strategy to stifle what Freire called conscientisation, or critical consciousness, thereby ensuring that the oppressed internalize their subjugation. This is not a byproduct of governance, but a deliberate strategy. The state has cultivated an environment in which intellectual inquiry is viewed as a threat to national stability. To think critically in Rwanda is to invite suspicion. To speak openly is to risk punishment. This anti-intellectual culture thrives on fear and flourishes through the systematic dismantling of spaces where independent thought could take root. Throughout history, societies under authoritarian rule have often attacked intellectuals. In Rwanda, this attack is subtle but devastating. It is not enough for the regime to silence critics. It must also destroy the very idea that critical thought is valuable. This begins in schools, where education is reduced to rote learning and obedience, reflecting a system designed not to foster inquiry, but to instill conformity. Freire warned against such indoctrination, contrasting it with education as a practice of freedom, where learners become critical co-creators of knowledge rather than passive recipients. In Rwanda, the classroom is not a site of inquiry, but a chamber of preemption. Here, questions are not answered, they are strangled at birth. The task of education is not to open the mind to the world's complexity, but to narrow it, to bend it, to render it docile. The school does not produce citizens capable of thought, but subjects drilled into submission, bearers of sanctioned truths. This logic carries into the media, where the journalist no longer stands at the frontier of truth, but at the service of its containment. The press is not an instrument of illumination, but an echo chamber of power's monologue. To investigate is to transgress. To report is to recite. What passes for news is merely the rehearsal of the same story, told again and again, until even memory forgets how to dissent. And this malady extends even into the arts, those spaces where, elsewhere, the imagination is sovereign. Here, creativity survives only if it flatters power, if it sings hymns to the state's magnificence, or else descends into the banal. The public sphere, stripped of depth, is now haunted by the spectacle of shame. Young women, old men, and disillusioned youth turned into performers of a grotesque intimacy. They ask not what it means to be free, but what position best pleases in the theater of flesh. The questions of the day are not about justice, or memory, or truth, but about how to mimic desire in front of a screen, how to survive, not with dignity, but with views. The very capacity to dream has been hollowed out, and in its place, performance, vulgarity, the desperate chase for relevance in a world where thinking has been outlawed. What remains of the public imagination is neither art nor protest. It is a mirror, cracked and smeared, reflecting back a society that no longer knows how to blush. The tragic case of Kizito Mihigo, a beloved gospel singer and peace activist, stands as a stark example. Mihigo's music, once praised for its message of reconciliation, became a target when he dared to mourn all victims of Rwanda's violence, not just those sanctioned by the official genocide narrative. Arrested in 2014, he was accused of plotting against the state, forced to confess under duress, and later died in police custody in 2020 under suspicious circumstances. His crime was not violence. It was the audacity to think and feel outside the state's control. Amable Karasira, a former university lecturer, used his platform to question the government's version of history and to call for open dialogue. His critical videos gained a wide following, but they also drew the regime's ire. He was arrested and charged with genocide denial and divisionism, classic tools used to silence dissent. His ongoing persecution is a chilling message to other intellectuals. Think at your peril. Chuma Hassan, a journalist with the YouTube channel Hashema TV, became known for his fearless reporting on local injustices, land disputes, and government negligence, especially in rural communities. He highlighted stories of ordinary Rwandans displaced by development projects and voiced concerns about corruption within local authorities. His investigative work, including interviews with marginalized citizens and critical coverage of government programs, brought him into direct conflict with authorities who viewed his truth-telling as subversion. Faced imprisonment for covering stories the government found uncomfortable. His work was not revolutionary in content, but it was radical in context. It sought truth outside the boundaries drawn by the state. By simply reporting on social issues and giving voice to ordinary citizens, he violated the unspoken rule that only state-sanctioned narratives may be heard. The case of innocent Bahati, a poet who disappeared in 2021, remains unresolved. His poetry, critical yet hopeful, reflected the dreams and frustrations of many Rwandans. But in a nation where unsanctioned emotion is dangerous, his words became a liability. His disappearance is a haunting symbol of what happens to those who dare to imagine differently. Let us render this episode not as mere incident, but as parable, a telling of the obscene fear that regimes of order harbor towards even the gentlest tremors of thought. On the 13th day of October, in the year 2021, on the threshold of what is marked elsewhere as the International Day of Solidarity with Political Prisoners, what Rwandans, in hushed reverence, have named Ingabire Day, a gathering of minds was deemed intolerable by the state, not for armed rebellion, not for seditious plotting, but for the scandal of reading. These individuals, seekers of language and possibility, found themselves criminalized for their encounter with a book, not a manifesto of war, not a call to arms, but a modest manual for nonviolence, blueprint for revolution, a text by Sergej Popovich that dares to imagine change without blood, resistance without destruction. Yet, even the idea of change, dressed as it was in the harmless garments of rice pudding and Lego men, summoned the full wrath of a government whose power thrives not in battlefields, but in the stifling air of thoughtless conformity. Theoneste Nsengimana, a journalist whose crime was not lies but truth told without permission, was among the first to be seized. As director of umubavu.com, a digital sanctuary for dissent, he knew the risk of speaking, but still spoke. Alongside him, 8 others, comrades in curiosity and members of Dalfa Umurinzi, stood accused. Names that are not echoes, but presences: Hamad Hagenimana, Emmanuel Masengesho, Alphonse Mutabazi, Marcel Nahimana, Jean-Claude Ndayishimiye, Alexis Rukubanganya, Sylvain Sibomana, Joyeux Uwatuje. Their assembly was not a rebellion, but a reading. Yet the regime, in its necropolitical calculus, treated words as weapons, books as bombs, and thoughts as crimes. 15 years. This is the measure of punishment allotted to those whose only defiance was to wonder aloud. The regime, in this act, unveiled its deepest terror, not of violence, but of dialogue, not of insurrection, but of reflection. For what does it mean when a government imprisons not for deeds, but for desires? It is a system that does not fear revolution on the streets. It fears the revolution that begins in whispers, in margins, in the quiet spaces where new worlds are dreamt. Here, the theater of power reveals its grotesque truth. To maintain itself, it must annihilate not just the body, but the mind's restless urge to imagine differently. Thought, in Rwanda, is the most radical act, and to possess a book is to possess a potentiality, a danger that no state founded on silence can tolerate. Thus, these arrests are not aberrations. They are rituals of control, sacrifices made at the altar of stability. They tell us to read is to risk, to discuss is to endanger, to dream is to disappear. And yet, it is in precisely such acts that the seeds of liberation lie. For every page confiscated, every voice stifled, every reader caged, the question only grows louder. How long can a nation survive that imprisons the very breath of its people's minds? This is the core of Rwanda's anti-intellectualism, the systematic eradication of spaces where ideas can grow. Intellectuals are not just silenced, they are discredited, imprisoned, or disappeared. The regime's survival depends not only on the control of power, but on the control of meaning, aligning with Michel Foucault's insight that power operates through discourse, shaping not only what can be said, but what can be thought. By dominating the language through which reality is interpreted, the state limits dissent not just by silencing voices, but by defining the very terms of truth, legitimacy, and identity. This monologic control mirrors Freire's critique of authoritarian cultures, where dialogue is replaced by unilateral communication, making it impossible for genuine mutual understanding or transformation to occur. And so, to think critically, to question, to read, or to write, is to challenge the very foundation of the state's authority. This culture of fear ensures that many choose self-censorship. Potential thinkers retreat into silence, not out of ignorance, but out of a keen awareness of the consequences. Figures like Dr. Christopher Kayumba, once a prominent academic and political commentator, now live in exile after facing charges widely seen as politically motivated. Dr. David Himbara, an economist and former advisor to Kagame, has extensively critiqued the regime from exile, offering detailed insights into its economic mismanagement, authoritarian tendencies, and manipulation of development narratives. His prolific writings and testimonies have made him a vital source for understanding the regime's inner workings, but also a target for vilification by those in power. After facing charges widely seen as politically motivated, others, such as Dr. Theogene Rudasingwa, a former insider turned critic, have chosen to remain abroad, their voices relegated to foreign platforms. These examples, among many, highlight a trend where intellectuals either silence themselves within Rwanda or are compelled to continue their work under the protection of distance. The climate of fear extends far beyond those who speak out, touching even those who might think to question. This internalized oppression, what Freire called the fear of freedom, manifests as a reluctance to engage in critical reflection, not because people do not know how, but because they have been conditioned to see such reflection as dangerous. In Rwanda, many have come to view submission as survival and questioning as an existential threat. The fear of freedom leads to a paradox where the oppressed both suffer under domination and cling to it, believing that safety lies in obedience rather than liberation. This fear does not emerge naturally. It is cultivated through years of controlled education, limited discourse, and the visible consequences faced by those who dare to think aloud. The tragedy is not just the loss of individual voices, but the erosion of an entire culture of inquiry. Freire argued that dehumanization is not a cause for despair, but for hope, leading to an incessant pursuit of the humanity denied by injustice. The struggle for critical consciousness, even in exile or silence, holds within it the seeds of a future where Rwandans can reclaim their right to think, speak, and transform their reality. The oppressed must recognize themselves as subjects of history, capable of naming and reshaping their world, not merely enduring it. Rwanda's future cannot be built on silence. It must reclaim its thinkers, honor its questioners, and defend the spaces where truth can be pursued without fear